I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the small velvet box, when I realized my husband had just handed me the key to his secret life. My name is Lorna Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and that Tuesday evening, I thought I knew my husband. I was wrong. Marcus had never missed a birthday in our 12 years of marriage. He'd wake me up with coffee and pancakes, sing off key while I pretended to be annoyed, and always have a gift that showed he'd been paying attention. The year I mentioned loving vintage earrings, he spent 3 months hunting down a pair from the 1940s. When I complained about my old running shoes, he researched for weeks to find the perfect replacement. But this year felt different. He'd been working late more often, business trips that came up suddenly, texts he'd angle his phone away from when I walked into the room, little things I told myself not to worry about, because Marcus was Marcus, steady, reliable, the man who still held my hand when we walked down the street. That morning, he left before I woke up. No coffee, no pancakes, no off-key singing, just a text at 7:42 a.m. Sorry, love, emergency meeting. We'll make it up to you tonight. Happy birthday. I spent the day pretending it didn't bother me. My coworkers brought cupcakes. My mother called. My sister sent flowers. But all I wanted was for Marcus to come home and make everything feel normal again. He arrived at 9:17 p.m. I know because I'd been watching the clock since 8 o'clock. He looked tired, genuinely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and his tie loosened. He kissed my forehead, the way he had 1,000 times before, and pulled a small wrapped box from his briefcase. Happy birthday, love, he said, and there was something in his voice, something off, a flatness that didn't match his words. I unwrapped it slowly, the way I always did, because Marcus liked to watch me open presents. Inside the velvet box was a silver bracelet, delicate, expensive looking, the kind of jewelry I would have loved, except it was engraved. Forever yours, M.R. My hands went cold. I stared at those letters, my mind racing through possibilities, trying to make them make sense. Marcus Robert Mitchell. Those were his initials, but Lorna started with R, not M.R., not both letters that belonged to him. Do you like it? He asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice, the desperate need for this moment to go well. I looked up at him, really looked, at the man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, the man who knew I took my coffee with too much cream, the man who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, and I saw something I'd been refusing to see for months: guilt. I said, "It's beautiful," my voice steady, calm. "Thank you." Relief flooded his face. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought I hadn't noticed. Or maybe he thought I'd noticed and didn't care, that I'd swallowed this betrayal the way I'd swallowed the late nights and the sudden business trips and the phone calls he took in the garage. He was fooling himself. That night, after he fell asleep, I went through the gift bag he left on the kitchen counter. There, crumpled at the bottom, was a receipt. Harrington Hotel and Spa, Denver, Colorado. Date, March 18th, 2 days ago. Marcus had been in Denver 2 days ago, supposedly visiting his college roommate in Seattle. The bracelet cost $847. It was purchased at the hotel boutique at 3:42 p.m. I sat there in the dark kitchen, holding that receipt, and something strange happened. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't wake him up and throw the bracelet at his head. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settle over me, like ice forming over a lake, solid, unbreakable. I had married a man I thought I knew. Turns out I'd been sleeping next to a stranger for months, maybe longer. The next morning, I told him I loved the bracelet. I wore it to work. I smiled when he texted me a heart emoji. And when I got home, I started making phone calls. First, I called our bank, transferred half of everything in our joint accounts to the personal account I'd opened years ago and barely used. Marcus made more money, but we'd always pooled everything. Marriage, he said, was about sharing. Then I called Janet, my college roommate who'd become a lawyer. She listened without interrupting as I told her about the bracelet, the receipt, the months of lies. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to fight or do you want to disappear?" I said, "Disappear," cleanly. She said, "I'll send you the papers." I didn't confront Marcus. I didn't ask him about Denver or the hotel or who MR was. Instead, I started packing. Not obviously, just the things that mattered. My grandmother's jewelry, the photos of my father, my favorite books. I boxed them up and moved them to a storage unit across town, one carload at a time. Marcus noticed nothing. He was too busy being relieved that I'd accepted his gift, that the crisis he'd been dreading had been averted. He started being nicer, bringing home flowers, suggesting date nights, touching me more often. It was almost funny watching him try to soothe a conscience I didn't even know he had. A week after my birthday, I told him I was going to visit my sister in Portland for the weekend. He barely looked up from his laptop when I said goodbye. Instead, I drove to Denver. 5 hours of highway, windows down, radio playing songs I hadn't listened to since college. Songs from a time when I believed love was simple and people meant what they said. The Harrington Hotel was exactly the kind of place Marcus would choose. Boutique-y, expensive, trying too hard to be sophisticated. I walked up to the front desk wearing sunglasses and my best business casual outfit. "Hi," I said to the young man behind the counter. "I think my husband left his watch here last week, Marcus Mitchell. He stayed here on the 18th. The man typed into his computer, and I watched his face carefully. Professional, neutral. Then, "Yes, Mr. Mitchell did stay with us. Let me check with housekeeping about any lost items." My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed steady. "Actually, do you mind telling me what room he was in? He's not sure if he left it in the room or at the restaurant." Another few keystrokes. "Room 412. He checked in on the 17th and checked out on the 19th. 2 nights, not one. He told me he was leaving Seattle on the 18th, which meant he'd been lying about the entire trip. And," I added, as if it had just occurred to me, "was the room under his name alone? Or—" The clerk glanced at his screen again. He shouldn't have told me. It violated privacy policies. But I was wearing a wedding ring and standing there with my husband's name on my lips, and he was young and wanted to be helpful. "The reservation was for 2 guests," he said. There it was. Confirmation. Not speculation, not paranoia, not my imagination running wild. Marcus had spent 2 nights in Denver with someone else, bought her a bracelet, and brought it home to give to his wife. I thanked the clerk and walked out of the hotel into the bright Colorado sunshine. I got in my car, drove to a coffee shop, and sat there for 2 hours, drinking terrible coffee and watching people live their normal lives. A couple arguing over a laptop, a mother bribing her toddler with a cookie, an old man reading the newspaper, his weathered hands steady on the pages. I thought about calling Marcus, screaming at him, demanding to know who she was, how long it had been going on, whether he had ever actually loved me, or if our entire marriage had been a performance. But I didn't. Because that would give him something I wasn't willing to give anymore. My emotional energy, my tears, my need for answers. Instead, I drove back home. I stopped at a lawyer's office and signed the divorce papers Janet had prepared. I arranged them to be served to Marcus at his office on the following Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after my birthday. When I got home, Marcus was making dinner. Pasta, my favorite. He'd opened a bottle of wine and lit candles. He was trying, really trying. And 6 months ago, maybe even 6 weeks ago, this would have melted me. I would have decided I was overreacting, that the bracelet was just a mistake, that the hotel receipt meant nothing. But that woman was gone. She died somewhere between the Velvet Box and the Harrington Hotel. "How's your sister?" Marcus asked, kissing my cheek. "Good," I said. "Great, actually. We had a really enlightening conversation." That night, I slept in our bed for the last time. Marcus wrapped his arms around me the way he always did, and I lay there, in the dark, counting his breaths, memorizing the weight of his body next to mine. Not because I loved him, but because I wanted to remember exactly what betrayal felt like, so I'd never let anyone do it to me again. The next morning, I told him I was going to work early. Instead, I went to the storage unit and loaded the last of my things into my car. Then I drove to my sister's house, the real one in Portland, where I'd be staying until I found my own place. I left Marcus a note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker he'd use when he woke up. It said, "Thank you for the bracelet. I hope MR appreciates the matching one. The divorce papers will be served to you at your office on Tuesday. I've transferred what's rightfully mine from our accounts. Everything else you can keep, including your secrets. Happy birthday to me." Marcus called 47 times that day. I didn't answer. He texted me paragraphs of explanation, of apology, of promises to change. I blocked his number. His mother called. His sister called. Even his college roommate, the one he'd supposedly been visiting, called to tell me Marcus had made a terrible mistake and I should give him another chance. I didn't respond to any of them. Because the thing about betrayal is that once you see it clearly, once you understand the full scope of the lie, there's no going back. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unfeel what you felt sitting in that hotel lobby hearing a stranger confirm that your husband had brought someone else to his room. Janet handled the divorce. Colorado was a no-fault state, which meant we didn't have to prove anything, didn't have to drag his affair through court. We just had to wait. Marcus tried to contest the division of assets, claiming I'd stolen from our joint accounts. Janet shut that down with a single letter citing my legal right to access marital funds. The divorce was finalized 4 months after my birthday. I didn't go to the courthouse. I had Janet handle everything while I sat in my new apartment, a small one-bedroom overlooking a park, and drank coffee that was better than anything Marcus had ever made. A week after the divorce was finalized, I received a package. Inside was the bracelet, the one Marcus had given me for my birthday. There was a note in his handwriting. "Lorna, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. She didn't mean anything. You were always the one. Please, can we talk? M." I held the bracelet for a long time, feeling the weight of it, reading those engraved initials that belonged to someone else. Then I walked to the park across the street and threw it into the pond. I watched it sink, silver glinting in the murky water, disappearing like the last 12 years of my life. And for the first time since my birthday, I cried. Not because I missed Marcus, not because I regretted leaving, but because I was grieving the woman I'd been before I opened that velvet box. The woman who'd believed that love was enough, that marriage was sacred, and that the man sleeking beside her would never look her in the eyes and lie. But grief is funny. It doesn't last forever. It transforms you, hollows you out, and fills you back up with something harder, something that knows its own worth. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop, a different one, in a different city, starting a different life, when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi, Lorna. This is Morgan Riley. I think we need to talk about Marcus." M.R. The woman from the bracelet. The woman from the hotel. The woman Marcus had chosen over 12 years of marriage. I stared at that message for a long time, then I typed back. "There's nothing to talk about. He's all yours. I hope you know what you're getting." She responded immediately. "Actually, he did the same thing to me. I just found out he's engaged to someone new. I thought you should know. You weren't the only one he lied to." And there it was, the final piece of the puzzle. Marcus hadn't left me for Morgan. He'd been juggling both of us and probably others. We weren't special. We weren't chosen. We were just convenient. I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry he hurt you too. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." We never did talk, but knowing that Marcus's pattern had continued, that he hadn't changed, that the woman he'd chosen over me had also been discarded, it didn't make me happy. It made me grateful. Grateful that I'd opened that velvet box. Grateful that I'd found that receipt. Grateful that I'd driven to Denver and asked the right questions. Because if I hadn't, I'd still be making coffee for a man who'd been planning his next lie before he even gave me that birthday gift. My name is Lorna Mitchell. I'm 39 years old now, and I finally know myself. Not the woman who stayed, not the woman who forgave, not the woman who made excuses. I'm the woman who found the receipt, who drove to Denver, who left a note on the counter, and walked away from a life built on lies. I'm the woman who chose herself. And you know what? That's the best birthday gift I ever received. Did you like my story? What city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. Now on to the next story. The next story is what I like to call the Garden of Mrs. Leung. I still remember the day I realized Mrs. Leung wasn't who I thought she was. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was watering the window boxes outside my flat on Girard Street when I saw her standing in the narrow alley between our buildings, her small frame wrapped in that faded green cardigan she wore every autumn. She was crying, but making no sound, just tears running down her weathered cheeks like rain on stone. My name is Lorna Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, and I've lived in Chinatown for 8 years now, ever since my divorce left me searching for some way that felt anonymous enough to rebuild. Mrs. Leung has been my neighbor for all of those years. A quiet woman in her 70s, she speaks very little English, keeps to herself, and tends to the small pots of herbs she grows on her windowsill with the kind of devotion I've only seen in people who understand that living things are prayers. I didn't know much about her, really. Her husband had died before I moved in. Her son, David, visited sometimes, always in a hurry, always on his phone. He worked in finance, I think. The kind of man who wore expensive watches and spoke too loudly. His wife, May, was different, softer. She would sometimes bring Mrs. Leung steamed buns on Sundays, and I'd see them through the window, sitting in silence together, sharing tea. But that morning, seeing Mrs. Leung cry in the alley, something shifted in me. I put down my watering can and approached her carefully, the way you might approach a wounded bird. "Mrs. Leung," I said gently, "are you all right?" She looked up at me, startled, and quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her cardigan. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a photograph. It was old, creased at the edges, showing a small house with a garden bursting with vegetables and flowers. Behind it, green hills rolled into the distance. "Home," she said in her careful English. "My home. Hong Kong." I understood then. Not the details, but the ache. The kind of loss that lives in the body like an old injury that never quite heals. What I didn't know that morning was that 3 weeks earlier, David had come to his mother with papers. Important papers, he'd said, legal documents that needed her signature. Something about taxes in Hong Kong, about the ancestral land her late husband's family had owned for generations. The small plot in the new territories where vegetables had grown for 100 years. "Just a formality, Mum," he'd told her, speaking Cantonese in that impatient way children use when they've forgotten their parents were once young. "We need to transfer some paperwork. You trust me, don't you?" And she had signed. Of course she had signed. He was her only child. The son she had fed and clothed and sent to university, working double shifts in restaurant kitchens while her husband drove a delivery van. The son she had believed in when no one else did. What she discovered, quite by accident, was that David hadn't been managing paperwork. He had sold the land. All of it. The half-acre plot where her mother-in-law had grown bok choy and gailan, where her husband had taught his son to dig in the soil, where she had imagined one day being buried next to the people she loved most. David had sold the land to a developer for £280,000, and he'd used a forged power of attorney to do it. Mrs. Leong found out because a cousin in Hong Kong had called, asking why the land was being cleared. Bulldozers had arrived that morning. The persimmon tree her husband planted the year they married was already gone. She didn't confront David. Not that day. Not ever. Instead, she did what she had done her entire life. She was silent. She waited. She planned. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes. Mrs. Leong stopped cooking elaborate meals. Her windowsill herbs grew wild, untended. She moved through the building like a ghost, and I worried about her. I started leaving her small things outside her door, a pot of jasmine tea, a scone from the bakery downstairs. Once, a postcard of the countryside because I thought she might like the green. What I didn't know was that Mrs. Leong was busy, very busy. She had called her cousin in Hong Kong, a lawyer named Thomas, who had helped her husband with his will years ago. She explained everything, her voice steady now, the tears dried. Thomas was furious, but Mrs. Leong stopped him before he could talk about lawsuits and family shame. "Can you buy it back?" she asked. "The land? It's already sold, Auntie." "Can you buy it back?" she repeated, more firmly this time. Thomas paused. "The developer hasn't started building yet. If someone made a good offer, quickly, before they break ground, maybe. But, Auntie, do you have that kind of money?" Mrs. Leong did have that kind of money. Not from her husband, but from her own mother, who had died 2 years earlier and left her a small inheritance. Money Mrs. Leong had been saving for her own funeral, for red envelopes at her grandchildren's weddings, for emergencies. This, she decided, was an emergency of the heart. She said, "Buy it, but not in my name. Use another name. Your name, a company, I don't care. Just buy it back." It took 3 weeks, a flurry of international calls, and £310,000, more than David had sold it for because the developer had already invested in planning. Mrs. Leong spent nearly everything she had. Thomas set up a small holding company, something anonymous and corporate. And just like that, the land came back. The bulldozer stopped. The persimmon tree was gone, but the soil remained. I only learned about all of this months later. At the time, I just noticed that Mrs. Leong seemed lighter. Not happy exactly, but less burdened. She started tending her herbs again. She began leaving her door open when she cooked, and the smells of ginger and star anise would drift through the hallway like memories. Then,
In early December, something else happened. May, David's wife, had always wanted to open a bakery. He trained as a pastry chef in Hong Kong before moving to London, but David had convinced her it wasn't practical, that they needed her to work in his uncle's restaurant where the money was guaranteed. So she spent 5 years making dim sum in a basement kitchen, her hands remembering the laminated dough and delicate sugar work she'd once dreamed of. One evening, May received a letter. It was formal, typed on cream-colored paper, from a company called Gold Thread Investments. They'd heard she was a skilled baker, the letter said. They were looking to support small businesses in the community, particularly those run by women. They were prepared to offer her £50,000 as an interest-free loan to start her bakery. The only condition? She had to run it herself, make all the decisions, and they would remain a silent partner. May thought it was a scam at first. She almost threw the letter away, but something made her call the number at the bottom, and a polite man named Thomas explained that it was legitimate. They believed in her. She could take as long as she needed to pay them back. There was no rush. David was suspicious, of course. He made phone calls, tried to find out who was behind Gold Thread Investments, but Thomas had set it up carefully, with layers of privacy that even a finance professional couldn't easily penetrate. Eventually, David convinced himself it was some kind of government grant, something May had qualified for because of her background. You should do it, he told her, magnanimous now that he thought it was free money. Open your bakery. So she did. May found a tiny shop space on Lizzle Street, barely more than a corridor with an oven, and she threw herself into it with the kind of devotion I recognized from watching Mrs. Lung tend her herbs. She made pineapple buns and egg tarts and Portuguese custard pastries. She made moon cakes with black sesame and red bean paste. She made things her grandmother had taught her, things she'd almost forgotten. I became a regular customer. So did half of Chinatown. There was something about May's baking that tasted like love, like memory. Within 3 months, there was a line out the door every morning. David started coming around more often then, proud of his wife's success, telling everyone how he'd encouraged her to follow his dreams. I'd see him standing in the bakery, watching the customers, calculating something in his head. It was on one of these visits, in late March, that everything unraveled. David was helping May close up the shop one evening when he noticed a small package behind the counter. It was addressed to May from Gold Thread Investments. Inside was a letter and a set of photographs. The letter was brief. We hope the bakery is bringing you joy. Enclosed are photographs of the land we've been restoring in Hong Kong. We thought you might appreciate seeing the persimmon trees we planted. The photographs showed a small plot of land in the new territories. The hills were unmistakable. David recognized them instantly. It was the land he'd sold. But now there were young persimmon trees, rows of them, and vegetable beds being prepared for planting. His hands started shaking. May looked at the photos over his shoulder. "How beautiful," she said. "I wonder why they sent these." But David was already dialing his phone, calling Thomas in Hong Kong, demanding to know who owned that land, who was behind Gold Thread Investments. Thomas, who had been waiting for this moment, simply said, "You'd have to ask your mother, David." The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. David drove to Mrs. Lung's flat that night. I heard him arrive, heard his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I didn't hear shouting, though. I heard nothing at all for an hour. Then I heard him leave, quietly, his footsteps slower than they'd been coming in. The next morning, I saw David again. He was sitting on the stoop outside the building, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face in his hands. When he looked up and saw me,
He looked like a man who had seen his own reflection and not recognized what was looking back. "She bought it back," he said, though I hadn't asked. "My mother, the land I sold, she spent everything to buy it back. And then she gave the rest to May, to my wife, not to me, to her." I sat down beside him, not knowing what to say. "I told her I was sorry," he continued, his voice hollow. "I told her I'd pay her back, every penny." And you know what she said? I waited. She said the land was never about money. She said it was about remembering where we came from. And the bakery wasn't a gift. It was a reminder that love grows best when you plant it in good soil and leave it alone. David looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something broken in him that might eventually heal into something better. "I thought I was taking care of her," he whispered. "I thought I knew what was best." "She was always taking care of you," I said gently. "You just didn't notice." That spring, Mrs. Long returned to Hong Kong for 2 months. May minded her flat and watered her herbs. When she came back, she brought photographs of the land, of the new persimmon trees growing strong, of her cousin Thomas standing in the garden with a bamboo rake, preparing the soil for summer vegetables. She also brought something for me, a small jade pendant on a red string. "For you," she said, pressing it into my palm, "for listening, for watering." "I didn't do anything," I protested. She smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her truly smile. She said, "You saw me. That is everything." David comes to visit his mother every Sunday now. He arrives early, stays late. He sits in her small kitchen while she cooks, and he's learning to be quiet, to listen. He's learning that love isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the spaces between words, in the patient tending of small things. May's bakery is thriving. She paid back gold thread investments within 2 years, though Thomas kept trying to tell her there was no rush. She and Mrs. Long have tea together every Sunday after David leaves. They sit in silence mostly, sharing almond cookies, watching the street below. I still live next door. I still water my window boxes. And sometimes, when the autumn wind blows through Chinatown, carrying the smell of Mrs. Lung's herbs and May's baking, I think about soil and roots and the quiet ways love teaches us who we really are. Mrs. Lung is 76 now. She moves a little slower, but her windowsill garden has never been more abundant. She grows things that remind her of home, Chinese chives and Thai basil, bitter melon vines that climb the fire escape. And in the corner, in a large ceramic pot, she grows a small persimmon tree from a cutting Thomas sent her from Hong Kong. It hasn't borne fruit yet, but she tends it every morning, and she waits. Because some things can't be rushed. Some things grow best in silence. And some kinds of justice are too quiet to hear, but strong enough to change everything. Did you like this story? We've got one more coming. If you enjoyed this story, you can support me by sharing with your friends so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. Now, on to the next one, The House on Maple Street. I was folding Jim's old flannel shirts when the doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of day where the sun comes out just long enough to make you believe spring might actually arrive. I had been a widow for 8 months, and I was still finding his things in unexpected places. A coffee mug behind the bread box, his reading glasses in the bathroom drawer. Each discovery was like a small earthquake. My name is Lorna Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, though some days I feel like I'm 82. I worked as a nurse for 18 years before I retired early to take care of Jim during his final months. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. Some people say that's a mercy, that is better than watching someone suffer for years. Those people have never watched someone they love disappear piece by piece in half a year. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I opened the door to find a young couple standing on my porch. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and a smile that seemed almost too bright for a cloudy March day. The boy was maybe a year or two older, dark hair, nervous eyes, his hand resting protectively on her lower back. "Mrs. Mitchell?" the girl said. "We saw your ad online about the room for rent." I had posted it 3 weeks ago. The house was too big, too quiet, too full of memories I didn't know how to organize. My neighbor Carol had suggested I rent out the spare bedroom upstairs. Extra income, Lorna, and you won't be alone in that big house anymore. "Yes," I said. "Come in." They introduced themselves as Emma and Tyler Hayes. Newlyweds, they said, saving money for their own place. Tyler worked at the auto parts store on Route 9. Emma was between jobs, looking for something in retail or hospitality. They were polite, eager, and somehow vulnerable in a way that reminded me of patients I used to care for, the ones who smiled too much because they were afraid of being sent away. "The room is upstairs," I told them, leading them through the house. "You'd have access to the kitchen and the living room. Bathroom is shared, but I'm usually up early for my morning walk, so we probably wouldn't cross paths much." Emma touched everything as we walked through the house. The banister, the photographs on the wall, the corner of Jim's favorite armchair that still sat by the window, positioned exactly where he left it. "This house has so much love in it. You can feel it." I didn't know whether that made me want to cry or ask her to leave. They moved in the following Saturday. 2 suitcases, a cardboard box of kitchen supplies, and a potted plant Emma said her grandmother had given her for good luck in new places. The first few weeks was surprisingly pleasant. Emma cooked breakfast sometimes and would leave a plate for me on the counter. Scrambled eggs with cheese, pancakes shaped like hearts. Tyler was quieter, but he fixed the loose board on the back porch without being asked and oiled the squeaky hinges on the bathroom door. "You don't have to do that," I told him one evening. "I know, but you're letting us stay here when you didn't have to. It's the least we can do." I started to think that maybe Carol had been right. Maybe having people in the house was better than the silence. One night, Emma knocked on my bedroom door around 10 o'clock. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you still awake?" I opened the door to find her standing in the hallway in an oversized sweatshirt, her eyes red. "What's wrong, honey?" "Can I ask you something?" She looked down at her hands. "Did you ever feel like you married the wrong person?" I invited her in, and we sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I'd shared with Jim for 19 years. "Why do you ask?" "Tyler and we got married because I was pregnant. I lost the baby at 12 weeks, but by then we'd already told everyone, moved in together, done the whole thing. And now sometimes I look at him and wonder if we would have even stayed together if it hadn't happened." "Do you love him?" "I think so. I don't know. Is that terrible?" I thought about Jim, about how I known from the first date that he was the one, about how even at the end, when the morphine made him confused and angry, I'd never once questioned whether I'd made the right choice. "It's not terrible," I said finally. "It's honest. And honey, you're so young. You have time to figure it out." She wiped her eyes. "Thank you for listening. I know you probably have better things to do than counsel your tenant about her marriage problems. I was a nurse for almost 20 years. Counseling comes with the territory." She hugged me before she left. It was the first time since Jim died that someone had hugged me like they meant it. 3 weeks later, they were gone.
I came home from the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon to find their room empty, bed stripped, closet bare. The only thing left was the potted plant on the windowsill, already starting to wilt. That's when I noticed other things were missing too. Jim's coin collection. He'd been collecting coins since he was a boy. Mercury dimes, buffalo nickels, a 1909 VDB penny that was worth more than our first car. He kept them in a wooden display case in his office, the room I'd been avoiding since he died because I couldn't stand to see his reading chair empty. The case was gone. 40 years of careful collecting, of weekend trips to coin shows, of teaching our nephew about mint marks and error coins. Gone. I stood in the middle of his office and felt something inside me crack. Not break, just crack, like ice on a pond in early spring. I called the police. They took a report, said they'd keep an eye out, but realistically, young couples who skip out on rent with stolen property are hard to track down. Did you run a background check? The officer asked. No. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, like I was just another lonely widow who had been taken advantage of. The next few months were the darkest since Jim's funeral. It wasn't just the coins, though those hurt. It was the betrayal. I had opened my home to them, listened to Emma's marriage problems, let them become something like family in that big empty house, and they had repaid me by stealing the one thing Jim loved besides me. Carol tried to help. You should be angry, Lorna. You should be furious. But I wasn't angry. I was just tired. I stopped renting the room, stopped answering the phone, spent my days walking through the house, touching things that Jim had touched, trying to remember the sound of his laugh. It was October when I saw Emma again. I'd started volunteering at County General, the hospital where I used to work, not as a nurse. My license had lapsed after I retired, but in the maternity ward, rocking babies whose mothers were too exhausted, running errands for new parents, bringing warm blankets and cold water. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I walked past the nursery viewing window and saw her. Emma, standing alone in front of the glass, staring at the rows of bassinets. She looked different, thinner. Her blonde hair was darker at the roots, pulled back in the same messy ponytail, but somehow sadder. She wore scrubs, blue ones with teddy bears on them, and an ID badge that said patient where a name should be. I should have walked away. Should have turned around and found a different hallway, a different floor, a different hospital. Instead, I stood next to her. "Which one is yours?" I asked. She turned, and I watched her face go through every emotion at once. Recognition, guilt, fear, shame. "Miss Mitchell, I, I didn't know you worked here." "I don't. I volunteer." "Which one?" She pointed to a bassinet in the second row. Pink card. Baby Girl Hayes. 6 pounds, 3 ounces. "She's beautiful." Emma started to cry. Not the quiet tears from that night in my bedroom, but deep, shaking sobs that made the nurses at the station look up. I put my arm around her and guided her to a small waiting room down the hall. "Where's Tyler?" I asked, when she'd calmed down enough to speak. "Gone. He left when I told him I was pregnant. Said he wasn't ready to be a father. Said we had already lost one baby and he couldn't go through that again." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I've been living in my car for the past 3 months. The hospital social worker is trying to find me a place in a shelter, but they're all full." "And the baby's father?" "Tyler is the father. Was, I don't know. He doesn't want anything to do with us." I should have told her what she'd done. Should have confronted her about the coins, about the way she'd stolen from me. But when I looked at her, all I saw was a scared girl who'd made terrible choices and was now paying for them in ways she couldn't have imagined. What are you going to do? I don't know. I don't have family, no job, no place to live. The social worker said if I can't prove I have stable housing, they might not let me take her home. They might place her in foster care. Emma nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know I don't deserve to be her mother. I know I've made so many mistakes, but Mrs. Mitchell, when I look at her through that glass, I feel like maybe I could do something right for once. Maybe I could be the person she needs me to be. I was a nurse for 18 years. I'd seen mothers high on drugs hold their babies for the first time and promise to get clean. I'd seen teenage girls with black eyes cradle their newborns and swear they'd leave their boyfriends. I'd seen women with nothing find everything they needed to fight for their children. Sometimes they kept those promises, sometimes they didn't. When do they discharge you? Tomorrow morning, if I have somewhere to go. I took a deep breath. Jim used to say that the hardest choices in life are the ones between what's fair and what's right. What was fair would be letting Emma face the consequences of her choices. What was right was something entirely different. You can stay with me. Her eyes went wide. What? The room upstairs is still empty. You can stay there until you get on your feet. Mrs. Mitchell, I can't. After what we did. I know what you did, Emma. She looked down at her hands. I'm so sorry. I wanted to mail them back so many times, but Tyler said we needed the money more. He sold them to a dealer in the city. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't want to. But you did anyway. Yes, she met my eyes. I did. And I've regretted it every single day since. Good. Regret means you understand what you did was wrong. That's the start. Why would you help me after what you did to you? I thought about Jim, about the nights I'd sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand while the morphine made him delirious. About the morning he died, when his last words were, "Take care of people, Lorna. That's what we're here for. Because someone has to. And because that baby didn't do anything wrong. She deserves a chance." Emma and baby Caroline came home the next day. I'd prepared the upstairs room the same way I used to prepare for new patients on the ward. Fresh sheets, clean towels, a bassinet I'd borrowed from the hospital's lending program, diapers and formula, and tiny pink onesies from the discount store on Route 9. The first few nights were hard. Caroline cried every 2 hours. Emma was exhausted, still healing from delivery, overwhelmed by the reality of caring for a newborn alone. I found myself getting up in the middle of the night to help, just like I used to do when our nephew visited as a baby. You don't have to do this, Emma said one morning at 3 a.m., both of us bleary-eyed in the kitchen while I warmed a bottle. I know. You stole from me. You betrayed my trust. You should hate me. Probably. But hating you won't help Caroline. Carol by the following week with a casserole and a lot of questions. Lorna, are you out of your mind? This is the girl who robbed you. I know who she is. And you're letting her live here? With a baby? Yes. Why? I looked at Carol, my friend of 15 years, and tried to explain something I barely understood myself. Because
Jim used to say that the world is full of people who need punishment and people who need help. And sometimes they're the same people. Emma did something terrible. She knows it. She carries it with her every day. Making her suffer more won't bring Jim's coins back, but helping her might give Caroline a chance at a better life. You're too good, Lorna. That's your problem. No, I'm just trying to do what Jim would have wanted. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Emma started to heal, not just physically from the birth, but in deeper ways. She found a job at the diner on Main Street, working breakfast shifts while I watched Caroline. She started taking online classes in early childhood education. She opened a savings account and put away $10 from every paycheck. One night, about 6 weeks after they'd moved in, Emma knocked on my bedroom door again. She was holding something wrapped in newspaper. "I need to show you something," she said. We went downstairs to the kitchen, and she unwrapped the newspaper carefully, and inside was a single coin, a 1909 VDB penny, the same one from Jim's collection. "I only managed to save this one," she said, her voice shaking. "I told him I'd already sold it. I kept it because I knew someday I'd need to make this right." She placed it on the kitchen table between us. "This was Jim's favorite," I said softly. "I know. You told me that. The night we were talking about the collection. You said it was the first coin his father ever gave him. You remembered." "I remember everything from those weeks, Mrs. Mitchell. I remember how kind you were, how you listened to me, how you made me feel like maybe I wasn't just some screwed up kid who'd made a mistake. And then I went and proved that's exactly what I was." I picked up the coin, feeling its weight in my palm. Jim had shown it to me on our third date, explaining the controversy about the designer's initials on the reverse, how excited he'd been to find one in good condition at an estate sale. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" "Because I was afraid if I did, you'd kick me out, and I had nowhere else to go. But now, Caroline needs this more than I need a place to live. She deserves a mother who does the right thing, even when it's hard." I looked at Emma, really looked at her. This wasn't the bright-eyed girl who'd shown up at my door 8 months ago. This was a mother, a woman who understood what sacrifice meant. "Keep it," I said. "What?" "Keep it. Put it somewhere safe. When Caroline is old enough to understand, give it to her, tell her it came from Jim Mitchell, and tell her what it represents." "Mrs. Mitchell, I can't." "Yes, you can. Consider it a gift from my husband to your daughter." Emma started crying again, but this time they were different tears. "What does it represent?" "That everyone deserves a second chance. That mistakes don't define us, but how we respond to them does. That sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in money." "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for the room, for helping with Caroline, for not hating me." "I did hate you," I said honestly, "for a while. But hate is exhausting, Emma, and life's too short to carry that kind of weight." Carol came by the next morning while Emma was at work. She found me in Jim's office, finally packing up his things. The books he'd never finished, the papers he'd been meaning to organize, the empty space where his coin collection used to be. "So she gave you back one coin. That's something, I guess." "She didn't give it back. I told her to keep it." "Lorna, it's not about the coins anymore, Carol. Maybe it never was." "Then what is it about?" I picked up one of Jim's flannel shirts, the blue one he'd worn every Saturday morning. It still smelled faintly like him, Old Spice and coffee and home. "It's about what we leave behind. Jim left me those coins, sure. But more than that, he left me a life built on helping people, on seeing the good in them even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Emma and Tyler took the coins, but they couldn't take that. So you're just going to let us stay here, as long as she needs to. And if she steals from you again, she won't."
How do you know? Because she has something to lose now. Before she had nothing. That's when people make desperate choices. But now she has Caroline, and she has a chance to be better than she was. Carol shook her head, but she was smiling. Jim married a saint. No, he married a nurse. We're trained to see people at their worst and find a way to help them anyway. Emma graduated from her online program 2 years later. I watched from the audience as she walked across the stage, Caroline on my lap, both of us clapping and cheering. She'd been offered a job at the hospital's pediatric ward, working with premature babies and their families. Everything I learned about caring for people, I learned from you, she told me that night over celebration cake in our kitchen. Our kitchen. That's what it had become.
Caroline doesn't understand yet, but someday she will. She'll look at that coin on her wall and understand that it represents something much bigger than currency. It represents the moment her mother chose to be honest, even when honesty was hard. It represents the moment I chose forgiveness over fairness. It represents the moment we both chose to build something new from the broken pieces of our lives. This is the house on Maple Street. It's not the same house Jim and I built together. It's something different now. Something that holds 3 generations of mistakes and mercy, of theft and redemption, of justice that looks nothing like punishment and everything like grace. Carol still doesn't fully understand why I did what I did. She thinks I'm too soft, too forgiving, too willing to let people off the hook. But she wasn't there the night Emma came home with Caroline and stood in the nursery doorway, watching her daughter sleep, whispering, "I'm going to be better for you. I promise I'm going to be better." She wasn't there the morning I found Emma at the kitchen table, crying over bills she couldn't pay, and watched her go to work anyway because she refused to give up. She wasn't there the afternoon Caroline called me grandma for the first time, and I realized that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses you even when they have every reason not to. The coins are gone. 40 years of Jim's careful collecting, sold to a dealer in the city for probably a fraction of their worth. Sometimes I think about them scattered to collectors across the country, sitting in albums and display cases, valued for their rarity and condition. But the real treasure is here. It's in Caroline's laugh. It's in Emma's hard-won stability. It's in this house that's alive again with the sounds of a family that chose each other against all odds. Jim would have understood. He always said, the best investment isn't in things you can hold in your hand. It's in people, in the possibility that humans can be better tomorrow than they were yesterday, in the radical idea that mercy is more powerful than revenge. Tonight, I'll make dinner for my family. Emma will tell stories about the babies in the NICU. Caroline will show me her kindergarten drawings. We'll eat together at the same kitchen table where Jim and I shared 19 years of meals. And I'll feel him there with us, approving, loving, grateful that his house is full of life again. This is justice. Not the kind that comes from courtrooms or revenge, the kind that comes from giving someone the chance to be better than their worst moment, the kind that turns stolen coins into life lessons, the kind that proves that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what we leave behind, but who we choose to lift up. The 1909 VDB penny on Caroline's wall catches the afternoon light. A small piece of history, a symbol of second chances, a reminder that the most precious things in life can't be stolen, sold, or lost. They can only be given away. And in giving them,
we find out who we really are. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by liking and subscribing so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. With love and respect. See you next time.